The Hazel tank has two different methods to choose from when installing the binding. Before the sew-along begins, we will review these options. Both methods use the same binding pattern pieces. For this demo, the larger piece will represent the bodice. First, the faux binding method. Begin by folding the binding in half, wrong sides together. It's recommended to press with an iron. To install, align raw edges of the binding against the right side of the fabric. Sew with a stretch stitch or a serger along the edge using a 3/8 inch seam allowance. The binding will be slightly shorter than the bodice, so the binding will be pulled slightly to lay flush with the bodice as you sew. Press the seam allowance up toward the binding side and top stitch using your preferred method and number of needles. I will be using a 2-needle cover stitch for the sew-along. Be sure to catch the seam allowance on the wrong side. The double fold method is a more traditional way to bind a top. Begin by creating memory folds in the binding. Fold the binding by bringing the long edges together in the midline and then folding it in half again. This will result in the binding being 1/4 of its original width. To install the double fold, the bodice will be wrong side up. Please note, it is also accepted to do the inverse of this and begin with the right side of the binding against the right side of the bodice. Choose based on personal preference. Open up your memory folds and align one long edge with the right side of the binding fabric against the wrong side edge of the bodice. Sew with a narrow stretch stitch or serger just shy of the fold line, which is approximately a 3/8 inch seam allowance. Again, stretch the binding slightly to lay flush to the bodice. Turn the bodice right side out and fold the binding along the memory creases, encasing the raw edges. Top stitch with either a stretch stitch or cover stitch using your preferred number of needles. Sew with the right side of the fabric facing up. You can either stitch fully along the binding or place one needle along the bodice and one along the binding. The end result of both methods is nearly identical from the front. On the back side, you'll see the serger line of the faux method and a clean finish for the double fold. Now let's sew up the Hazel tank. For the sew-along, I will be sewing the full-length split back view with the faux binding method. For all views, cut one B1 front bodice on the fold. Choose between a U-neck or V-neck line. Select the front bodice length that corresponds with your back bodice length. Also, cut one B3 upper split back piece on the fold. For the split back view, cut two B4 lower split back pieces mirrored. Choose between a cropped length or full length. Mark notches across the top and in the middle center back. For the binding, choose the binding that corresponds to the horizontal stretch of your fabric. One set is for fabrics with 50 to 75% horizontal stretch, and one set is for fabrics with greater than 75% horizontal stretch. Cut one C1 neck binding piece that corresponds with the neckline of your front bodice. For the Y back, cut one C2 binding piece. I will cut the longer dashed line for the adjustable back. Be sure to mark notches at center back, side seam, and shoulder points. For those who prefer a cut chart, they're available in the instructions. Additional supplies required include a bra slider if making the adjustable length Y back view. Lots of pins and clips are also needed. Place the lower split back pieces right sides together. Sew from the top of the center back to the notch approximately 4 to 5 inches below with a 5/8 inch seam allowance. Be sure to back stitch at the notch. Use either a narrow stretch stitch or a straight stitch with a walking foot. Press the remainder of the center seam 5/8 inch to the wrong side. Top stitch using a stretch stitch or cover stitch. Also, top stitch 1 or 2 horizontal lines just above the mid-back notches to secure the split back. Place the upper split back piece right side together along the assembled back, aligning along the curve. Pin at multiple locations along the edge. Sew with a stretch stitch or serger and a 3/8 inch seam allowance. Top stitch as desired with the seam allowance pressed to the upper piece. For all views, place the back bodice, front bodice, B1 right sides together, aligning at the side edges. Sew with a 3/8 inch seam allowance. Be sure not to sew off the flange of the hemline on the back piece. This will allow for a smoother hemline when finishing the tank. For this sew along, I am using the faux binding method in a V-neck tank. To follow along in the pattern, skip to step 12. Begin with the bodice right side up. Place the neck binding, C1, folded in half along the long edge, wrong sides together, along the neckline of the bodice. Align at center and at the shoulder points. You'll want to have the ends of the binding extend slightly past the shoulder points. Sew with a stretch stitch or serger. The neck binding is shorter than the neckline, so stretch the neck binding slightly as you sew. For the V-neck view, open the point of the V up as you sew past the center point, ensuring you have captured the bodice on all points. Top stitch the neck binding with the seam allowance pressed to the top. Use a stretch stitch or cover stitch and your preferred number of needles. Stitch within the width of the binding. Be sure to catch the seam allowance on the wrong side. Additionally, for the V-neck, we'll need to secure the center point of the binding. For both binding options, fold the bodice in half, right side together. Using a straight stitch or hand stitch, secure just the binding portion of the center point with a short stitch line. As a note on the long binding, given that this piece is very long, you may have to splice 2 pieces of fabric together. If doing so, attempt to make the seam somewhere on the back of the bodice, preferably near the side seam, to make it less conspicuous. Prepare the full binding by pressing in half wrong sides together along the long edge. Again, be sure notches are marked along the binding. Begin at center back with the end of the tail that has the half diamond. The end of the binding should extend slightly past the center point to ensure that it will be caught by the other end of the binding. Align the next notch at the side seam and the circle at the shoulder point. Align the second circle at the next shoulder point. Finally, the full diamond will align back at center point. Pin along the arm side at multiple locations. The binding will be shorter than the arm side length, so stretch it slightly, maintaining even tension around the arm side. Repeat on the other side. As you pin, ensure that the binding has not twisted. Starting with the short end of the binding at center back, sew along the binding with a scant 3/8 inch seam allowance using a stretch stitch or serger. Continue sewing up the length of the next strap to reinforce it. Continue down the other arm side. Stop sewing 2 to 3 inches shy of center back. The short binding length needs to be turned up as finished before sewing off the length. Fold the seam allowance to the top and pin in place. Continue sewing to center back and up the length of your binding piece. With the seam allowance pressed toward the top stitch using a stretch stitch or cover stitch. Start at center back on the short binding side. Top stitch along the arm side. As you get to the shoulder strap, fold the seam allowance so it is underneath the binding and continue along the length of the strap. Top stitch down the other arm side. And extend the full length of your binding piece. If not using the adjustable optional slider, bring the long end of the binding over the shoulder strap from back to front. Pin or clip in place to try on and assess fit. The points of the shoulder should sit at your clavicle. The back of the shoulder strap should sit down off your neck, creating a V, and the center back should sit between the bottoms of your clavicles. Adjust length as needed and secure with a horizontal straight stitch. The long strap should sit snug against the neck strap so it doesn't float freely. To install the slider, with the bodice back side up, slide the binding tail up one side of the slider from the bottom, over the center, and down into the opposite slider opening. Wrap the binding tail over the shoulder strap from back to front. Loop the tail back through the slider under the first pass in the opposite direction. Lastly, turn the tail back up towards the top of the tank and pin in place. At this point, it's recommended to try on the tank to adjust the length of the tail and placement of the slider. Once you're happy with the fit, sew the long end of the tail down to only the middle piece of the binding with a horizontal reinforcing stitch. Trim any excess binding. Finally, fold and press the hemline up by 5/8 of an inch to the wrong side of the bodice and top stitch using a stretch stitch or cover stitch. And with that, your hazel tank is complete. Congratulations! Tag your make on social media using the hashtag GSHazelTank. Happy sewing, friends!